more investigation into the crisis in this country, about why Britain can't deport foreign paedophiles, because shockingly, foreign child sexual offenders are escaping deportation. Last week, it transpired that the Home Office had blocked deporting a Congolese paedophile. The researcher and journalist Sam Bidwell. Now, Sam, you've done so much on discussing the ECHR and the human rights crisis in our asylum law and our failure to deport people. What's going wrong here?
Unfortunately, this case is shocking, but it isn't surprising. What's really happening here is...
Here's a tough question for you. Why can't Britain deport foreign paedophiles? Now, they say that the first priority of any state is the defence of the realm. But that must surely include removing foreign threats to the safety of our children. Now, in our prison population, there are 76,800 British nationals, and there are 10,400 foreign nationals, making up just under 12% of the total population. And under the Borders Act, anyone serving a 12-month sentence must be deported. But in reality, very few of them are. And I asked that question at the top of this discussion about why Britain can't deport foreign paedophiles, because shockingly, foreign child sexual offenders are escaping deportation. Last week, it transpired that the Home Office had blocked deporting a Congolese paedophile. He'd arrived in Britain in 2008. He's an asylum seeker from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When he arrived in 2008, he was 36 years old and he settled in Glasgow, in Scotland. Now, his bid for asylum was rejected, not in 2008, not in 2009, but in 2014, 6 years after he arrived and made that application. But he obtained leave to remain on the grounds that he'd started a family in Britain. A 6-year wait for that approval. It was denied, but he was still allowed to stay. Now, despite the fact that the Home Office had determined that he should not be in the country, he was able to get legally married, become the stepfather to his wife's daughter, and father a child of his own, who was born in 2012. Now, why was this man, who had not achieved his asylum claim, not removed from the country between 2008 and 2014, that 6-year gap? The Home Office has not explained this. Now, since 2014, the man has had 2 more children of his own. But in 2022, this Congolese migrant was convicted at Glasgow High Court for the violent sexual assault of 3 young girls, namely his own stepdaughter and 2 of his wife's nieces. Now, for this appalling abuse, he received just 3 years imprisonment. And because anyone who's serving a 12-month prison sentence, if they are a foreign national, is automatically facing deportation orders, the same deportation notice was issued for him in August 2022. But he protested the move on 2 grounds. First, he said that he was going to be persecuted for his political views if he was deported. This is a classic approach for failed asylum seekers around the world, and it often works. And the first-tier tribunal, which hears these cases in immigration law, they rejected this argument, finding that this man, he was not entitled to refugee status on the grounds that he was a serious criminal. But his second argument was accepted, and this view is far more effective for asylum claims, because he said that deporting him from Britain would interfere with his right to a private and family life. Now, just listen to that. A man who's been convicted of sexually assaulting 3 children successfully managed to secure his safety and his continued existence in Britain because it would be interfering with his right to a private and family life to deport him. Now, he has this right under the Human Rights Act of 1998, a right that came from the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, other arguments put forward by this Congolese migrant include that his 3rd son suffers from serious behavioural issues. His wife is apparently relying on his continued support due to those disorders for his child. And this, according to the same tribunal that passed his right to remain, was sufficient grounds to keep him in the country, despite the fact that he had sexually assaulted his own stepdaughter. That, they say, gives him a right to a family life. Well, joining me now to discuss this case and the wider crisis around deportation and human rights legislation is researcher and journalist Sam Bidwell. Now, Sam, you've done so much on discussing the ECHR and the human rights crisis in our asylum law and our failure to deport people. And you've done a lot to publicise this recent crisis with a Congolese man who's not been deported despite sexually assaulting 3 children. In as quick a summary as you can, what's going wrong here?
Sure, and thanks for having me on, Charlie. Unfortunately, this case is shocking, but it isn't surprising. This kind of case, this style of case, is unfortunately characteristic of a lot of what goes through our immigration tribunal system nowadays. There are a couple of key things that you've already drawn out around defences to do with family life and to do with political persecution. These are classic arguments being made by those who apply for asylum, including those who apply for asylum having committed horrific crimes. But there are a couple of key things it's worth drawing out here. This is not an issue around an individual case. This is a systemic issue. This cuts across the entire immigration and asylum system. And as you say, rightly, it starts with the Human Rights Act 1998, which sets in train the current regime of human rights here in the UK. We, in fact, have a very old tradition of human rights, which goes back centuries. We didn't get the right to freedom of speech in 1998. We had a human rights system before Tony Blair brought in this legislation. But ever since then, human rights has started to intrude on our attempts to control our own borders, to remove foreign criminals. And this is crystallised not just by the human rights law, but by the tribunal system that we have. So the way it works is that if the Home Office decides that somebody needs to be deported, a deportation issue is ordered under the appropriate legislation. The first-tier tribunal hears the case. We don't know any details of first-tier tribunal cases unless they're appealed. So just to be clear, the vast majority of deportation cases in the UK are heard at first-tier tribunal. In fact, all cases are heard there first. Many cases stop there. We have no information about who is being tried at these first-tier tribunals, what orders courts are and are not overturning. If we get an appeal, whether that's the migrant or asylum seeker appealing the Home Office's decision, or the Home Office appealing a decision by the first-tier tribunal, then we get let in on the case details. We get to hear all about it. But the upper tribunal still, as we saw in this case, has to wade through the human rights legislation. In this case, the details were brought to our attention by the upper tribunal. The upper tribunal, in fact, found that the first-tier tribunal had decided wrongly. And they decided that what had basically happened is, in assessing whether or not this man's right to a family life outweighed the Home Office's aims in removing him from the country, the report into that issue hadn't considered the well-being of the man's stepdaughter, who he'd sexually assaulted. So we talk about child protection. We say that this is a system that protects children and makes sure that parents stay with their kids and it makes sure that family stays together. If it was really about child welfare, would they not have asked the stepdaughter for her opinion about whether or not her rapist should be allowed to stay in the country? In fact, it's not about child protection and it's not about keeping families together. It's about frustrating the Home Office's efforts to remove criminals from the country.
Now, Sam, you just mentioned the rights of the victim, the survivor of that appalling abuse by this Congolese migrant. People always come back to this whenever I've done investigations or reports on child sexual exploitation or abuse. They always say that they feel as though the rights of the perpetrator are almost always valued above and beyond the rights of the victim. And it's pretty clear in these cases, is it not, that those victims just aren't considered in this process. As you said, that evidence just not being heard. How can you ensure the safety of those children after a decision like that to keep someone in the country? And as you say, this is not a rarity. There was Anisette Maela, who was also Congolese, recently sentenced to 10 years in prison for raping and impregnating a 15-year-old girl in Oxford. In 2005, that man's deportation was blocked on human rights grounds. He was allowed to stay. He went on to commit that appalling abuse. And again, in October, just last month, We also heard about an Indian paedophile who was known as HS. His deportation was blocked by the Home Office on the grounds that, again, removing him from Britain would interfere with his right to a family life. At what point, Sam, will people start to think about the right to a safe life for children? And at what point do you think legislators will prioritise that perspective over the right to a family life for those who abuse children? Is that possible?
Well, look, I'm not holding my breath. Certainly not under this government. Look, it is about rights, not just about human rights, but about the right of a nation to enforce its laws, the rights of the people of this country to walk safely in the streets, the right of the nation's children to know that we're doing all we can to protect them from criminal elements like the gentleman in the case that you referred to. In fact, it would actually be a pretty easy fix. This is an issue of political will. It would be a case of removing asylum decisions from this endless process of appeal and review, because we know the people within the appeal and review system, the people who work in tribunals and who work in immigration law, are activists. Many of them are not interested in defending the nation's borders. They're interested in keeping as many people in this country as possible. They're ideological, they're activists. And we saw today, just earlier today, that the Justice Secretary has in fact announced more funding for immigration lawyers in an effort to shift the asylum backlog. Well, the first thing I would do is stop many of these erroneous cases and appeals from being launched in the first place. So I would outright prevent asylum applications coming in from certain countries. We have asylum applications that come in from the United States, that come in from France. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, he's not worth seeking asylum over. We can then start to say, well, if the Home Office makes a deportation order of a foreign criminal, that should not be going through 3, 4, 5, 6 stages of review. We shouldn't be allowing these people to remain in the country, often for decades, as they go through that review process. Maybe you can review from abroad. You can come in digitally. We've got the power of video link nowadays. But they certainly shouldn't be sitting in this country, clogging up housing and creating asylum backlog. This is a matter of political will. This is politicians not wanting to upset their friends who work as immigration lawyers, rather than actually fixing the asylum backlog and protecting the rights of children and of the British people as a whole. We have a government that seems set on making life easier and better for immigration lawyers without actually addressing the problem of asylum and asylum seekers.
Sam, let's go back to that 6-year period, 2008 to 2014, when this Congolese man was not removed from the country despite that failed asylum application. Now, the Oxford Migration Observatory has estimated that 9 in every 10 people who were refused asylum by the Home Office were free to remain in the country. Now, explain to our viewers how that's possible. How can there be a situation where the Home Office says, no, your asylum claim hasn't worked, despite it being, let's be frank, fairly liberal to most claims, especially on political persecution and the right to family life. It's not worked out. We've rejected that, but they just stay. How can that happen? Is it basically the case that if you turn up in Britain and put in an asylum claim, you're pretty much guaranteed that you'll just be allowed to remain?
Well, yeah, as you say, it's one of the most liberal asylum systems in the world. If we're saying no to you, you probably are really rotten. What's really happening here is a process of delay. It's lawfare, it's institutions. What we have is a system where once your initial claim is rejected, you can seek appeal over and over and over and over and over again on different grounds. You can say that your circumstances have changed. You can, a lot of these people come from quite fractious and difficult countries, and so what they'll say is, well, you turned down my application when this chap was in charge, but actually the government's changed, or the war's gotten worse, or crime is escalating, unrest is escalating, etc. So they find ways to keep appealing. Now, during that process, the Home Office is paying for their housing, because of course they can't get out onto the housing market if they're asylum seekers, or they're living in illegal housing, as is often the case. These people don't work. So we're paying for them, we're giving them stipends, we're keeping them fed and watered. That's very costly for the British taxpayer. And so the Home Office is incentivized, okay, well, if we can't remove them that way, what we want is a decision of a grant of asylum, because then we can take them off our books. So it's not just that they can appeal over and over again, it's that the Home Office is incentivized for them to keep appealing. And to keep appealing, ideally successfully, so that they can then go out and rather than being on the Home Office's books, they're on the books of some local council that has to pay for their social housing. But that 6-year period that you referred to is primarily a result of that delay process. It's a gentleman who's been able to apply again and again and again, or who's been able to find new grounds on which to appeal. We know in that period of time he was legally married, so he was known to the state, at least in that interaction. And yet, in that first instance, he was told no. And yet he was allowed to do all of that. He was allowed to start a family. He was allowed to get married. He presumably was living in Home Office accommodation for all that time. And again, if we're interested in getting down that backlog, which the government has said it wants to fix, one way you could start is by making sure that if somebody is rejected for an asylum claim in the first instance, they can't just sit here in the UK and apply and apply and apply. We've got an online system now. Go online, apply online if you like, but you certainly can't do it from a taxpayer subsidised house.
And Sam, you're mentioning there some of the incentives for the Home Office. You want to hurry up the decisions, move them along, approve them, get them off their books, especially when they've got this ginormous backlog caused by the state's total failure to deal with the small boat crisis. Here's another incentive that I think we should discuss. They keep losing asylum seekers. The Home Office had to admit in November of last year that it does not know where 17,000 asylum seekers are. They're just gone. They've disappeared. They're off the books. They can't find them. They can't deal with those claims. That's an embarrassing statistic for them to have. They'll want to hurry up claims and approve them sooner, will they not? Because one of the risks that they face, one of the embarrassing things that they face, not only is having a big backlog, but also just that they just go off on their own and they disappear and they can't contact them anymore. Is that a threat, Sam Bidwell, to this country's safety and security? Having tens of thousands of people arrive in this country, we don't know much about them, if anything in some cases, and in time they can disappear from the state's grasp, potentially go on to commit the sort of heinous crimes that we're hearing more and more about through these tribunals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look at where these asylum seekers are coming from. This is, they're by and large, though I mentioned there were a couple, they're by and large not coming from France, they're not coming from the US, they're not coming from Germany. They're coming from very dangerous societies, high crime societies, often gang crime societies. We've seen a large number of asylum seekers from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Congo, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as in this case. It is clearly a problem if there are unaccounted for individuals. Mostly they're young men. We know these statistics. I believe GBNews covered some of the statistical releases from the Home Office not long ago. We know that it's disproportionately young men who are applying for asylum from these dangerous societies. We know that there is a problem in this country with immigration-related gang crime. And so what we're doing is we're adding to an existing problem. And it's not an issue we have any oversight over anymore, because, as you say, people are leaving Home Office custody. We don't know where they're going. Your viewers at home might be surprised. I mean, Britain's state capacity, its ability to collect, store, process data is terrible, particularly on the issue of immigration, largely because immigration data is often inconvenient, particularly if you're somebody who benefits from the existing status quo of high migration and a relaxed asylum system. Neil O'Brien, the Conservative MP, has done great work in highlighting some of the data deserts that immigration restrictionists face. But to give you just a couple of examples, we literally don't know the number of people coming in and out of the country. We don't know how many asylum seekers have left the country. We're estimating when we talk about these figures. We don't really know what's going on in the labour force. So the ONS's labour force participation rate. So we try and collect surveys about the entire labour force, work out where people are working, whether they're working legally or illegally, etc. It stands at less than 17%. In countries like Australia, it's more than 90%. So we have a state that really doesn't know who's here, doesn't know what they're up to, often doesn't know if they're involved in crime. And of course, as you say, the Home Office will go, well, look, once they're off our books, it's not embarrassing if they go out and commit crime and rent houses outside of the normal market procedures, because that's not us. It's not on us anymore. So what they want to do is they want to get these people out of the asylum system as quickly as possible. If we live in a system, as we do now, where there are institutional blockers to removing people through the tribunals and through judicial review and all these other ways of frustrating what ministers want to do in the Home Office, then of course what they'll do is say, well, we can't go that way, we'll go the other way, and we'll try and make sure that as many of these people get accepted as possible.
I mean, Sam, this sounds to me like a total abdication of responsibility from the Home Office and the government more widely. They're failing these basic duties. And I just bring it back to what I said in my introduction about the defence of the realm, the first duty of any government. And we can talk at length, of course, another time perhaps about Britain's defences. Are they up for the job? But I think we should talk about the asylum crisis in the same sort of language, with the same sort of perspective, thinking about this as a national security and national crime concern. Because when all these scenarios we talk about a right to a family life, the first discussion and the first thought, should it not, instead be a right to a safe Britain, a right to knowing who's in your neighbourhood when they arrive from overseas, a right to be sure and to be sound in the knowledge that the Home Office is accurately, is diligently and is safely processing information about asylum claims, not delaying them by years, and certainly not failing to deport people when they fail their asylum claims. Now, is this a national security discussion for you? Is this a national crime discussion for you? Not only because of the sort of places where many of these asylum seekers are coming from, but also because the state just isn't maintaining that primary duty.
Absolutely. Look, we should live in a country where your Home Office, your Justice Department and your Home Office work in service of the people who elect parliamentary politicians and who therefore have say over who's a minister and who is not a minister. Right? We live in a democratic system, and a democratic system should put its citizens first, the people who make up the country, pay taxes, contribute to the building of a society, etc. The Home Office shouldn't serve the interest of foreign paedophiles. It should go without saying. This is ridiculous that we have to have this conversation, because at any other point in history, and in most other countries in the world, the idea that there is a department of government which time and time again, either through its own negligence or because of institutional fetters placed on it by politicians, the idea that we have a government department which puts foreign criminals ahead of the citizens of the country is absurd. This is not something... I talk to friends in all sorts of parts of the world, in Japan, in the Middle East, or wherever, and they think it's absurd. They think it's ridiculous.
And Sam, is it enough just to leave the ECHR to deal with this problem? You've mentioned previously about how so many of these cases are blocked and these deportations are prevented due to that right to a family life claim, which comes from the ECHR and is in the Human Rights Act. Would that be a silver bullet? Leaving the ECHR, this all stops, we deport the foreign paedophiles, and we can be safe and sound that that's now dealt with. Is that enough, or do you think a more broader approach to dealing with this issue is required?
Look, I'm afraid it's a more complicated issue. The ECHR is definitely part of the problem, and we've got to think seriously not just about our long-standing membership of the ECHR, but about the way we give effect to the ECHR in domestic law. That's the Human Rights Act. Not every country that's an ECHR member has a big problem with deportations. Yes, most Western countries do, but countries like Turkey and Serbia and Azerbaijan certainly don't. They're pretty illiberal countries, and yet they manage to remain members of the ECHR. So it is primarily about what we do here at home in Britain. It's about our domestic rules and regulations. We have a tribunal system, as I mentioned, that is not transparent, so we don't know on what grounds people are being kept in the country or removed from the country. That has to change. In my view, we should be taking immigration decisions out of the hands of activist judges and lawyers and making sure that a minister's decision, a stamp of approval from a minister on a deportation order, is final. Right? What that would do is it would put immigration and asylum decisions back into the hands of political decision makers who can be removed by the public if they're not happy with their performance, instead of having a system where political decision makers have to battle over every individual deportation case with judges and lawyers. So I would go back to a system where, as we had before the Annes Minnick judgment of 1968, a system where decisions made by ministers are not reviewed by courts unless a decision is made on an area for which the minister isn't responsible. So if your Home Office minister is making decisions about healthcare, fair enough, step in, that's not appropriate. But when a Home Office minister makes a call about deportation, that should be final. And there's no reason we can't have that, whether we're in or out of the ECHR. There's no reason that we can't have a system in which our ministerial decisions actually matter and aren't blocked by judges.
And Sam, Parliament is sovereign. We set the rules in Parliament in this country. That's how it works. If a minister wants that to be the case, it can be the case. So really, in effect, Sam, you're saying that the crisis of deporting foreign criminals, and in particular foreign paedophiles, an especially shocking example, all comes down to just the will to act. All of this could be changed, you're saying, but people are failing to sufficiently act according to the interests of people who want foreign paedophiles to be deported. They're not making the changes that are necessary according to what? Some sort of fascination with human rights legislation, a desire to be seen as tolerant and liberal on the world stage. What do you think is behind these sets of laws on our books? Is there a significant lobby by the human rights lawyer class that keeps this sort of legislation around and keeps this as the status quo? Why is this not changed? And why is this crisis going on?
Well, I'll tell you what it isn't, right? It isn't the public, right? If you were to pass laws that made it easier to deport foreign criminals and foreign paedophiles, you would gain millions of voters overnight, right? It would be the easiest thing in the world to do.
And yet,
here we are, right? And therefore you're forced to conclude that this is an issue of ideology. What we have is a section of the political class, a large section, unfortunately, of the current crop in Parliament, who believe genuinely that an individual's human rights, as described and codified by the Human Rights Act and by the ECHR, genuinely is sacrosanct, cannot be touched. There is nothing in the world, whether it's the safety of young girls in this country or the right of a state to enforce its own border laws. They believe that there is nothing that can countervail those rights. Right? This is a purely ideological obsession, and it is driven and supported by large sections of the legal community who stand to benefit from this. Many of them genuinely believe it. Most of them genuinely believe it. But it helps that they're all claiming six-figure salaries for jobs which would disappear if we moved to my system, in which it was politicians who were on the hook for immigration decisions, and we left the lawyers out in the cold altogether.
Let's move to my system. You've heard it there, folks, from journalist and researcher Sam Bidwell, who's been a really great chronicler of this particularly troubling sign of the crisis in Britain at the moment around foreign criminals not being deported from this country, even for crimes as heinous as child sexual abuse and exploitation. Sam, thank you very much for joining me for this discussion. I'm Charlie Peters. This has been a GB News original, going into more discussions, more investigation into the crisis in this country where foreign criminals are not being deported due to a very dangerous cocktail of human rights legislation and a failure from politicians to act and react. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.